They laughed at the American flying tank. But in just 1 month, that laughter would echo into silence over the Pacific. September 1943. The war in the Pacific had reached its cruel middle act, and at Rabaul Airfield on the island of New Britain, Japan's naval aviators still believed the sky belonged to them. The tropical air shimmered with heat and confidence. Mechanics wiped oil from the silver bellies of Mitsubishi Zeros, the same aircraft that had swept the Pacific clean of Allied opposition for nearly 2 years. Beneath the shade of a canvas tent, Lieutenant Colonel Kensuke Tanemori, a decorated ace of the 251st Air Group, sat reading an intelligence report that claimed the Americans had introduced a new carrier fighter. Its name, he read with mild amusement, was the F6F Hellcat. Twice the weight of a Zero, armor-plated, heavier than some bombers. He chuckled, shaking his head, a faint scar across his cheek deepening as he smiled. "Another American mistake," he said to the young pilot beside him. "They never learn. Machines can't replace men." Around him, laughter rippled through the tent. The Americans had built a beast too heavy to dance, too dull to survive the turning duels that Japanese pilots had perfected since the early days of China and Pearl Harbor. On the flight line, the Zeros glowed in the sun like coiled white dragons, sleek and perfectly balanced. For 2 years, they had humiliated every aircraft that dared challenge them. British Hurricanes, American P-40s, Dutch Brewsters, all had burned or fallen before their guns. To the men at Rabaul, the Zero was more than a fighter. It was proof of Japan's destiny in the air. The statistics were intoxicating. At Pearl Harbor, 29 aircraft lost for 347 destroyed. In the Philippines, 7 against 103. Over Darwin, 2 losses for 30 kills. Even the mighty Royal Navy had been broken. And now, the Americans were fielding a lumbering monster of steel and bolts that seemed to defy the very art of flight. Kensuke Tanemori folded the report, dismissing it as Allied propaganda. The Americans had always built their aircraft like they built their cars, solid, overpowered, and wasteful. Their pilots relied on engines and armor, not instinct and spirit. The Zero, by contrast, was a masterpiece of purpose. Its designers had stripped away everything that didn't serve agility. No armor plate, no self-sealing tanks, often not even a radio. Its skin was forged from a secret alloy that made it 30% lighter than anything the Americans could manufacture. It was the embodiment of an idea. That perfection in combat came from harmony between man and machine, not the thickness of its armor. That afternoon, Tanemori stood at the edge of the airfield, watching his squadron take off in 2s and 3s, their wheels leaving the steel runway in graceful unison. Above, the sound of engines blurred into a single, steady hum. For him, that sound was security, even beauty. Japan had built a generation of warriors who believed that victory came from skill, sacrifice, and faith in their own mastery. But as he watched the white contrails dissolve into the blue, a faint unease stirred in him. The report's words lingered. Armor-plated, radar-guided, mass-produced. They sounded alien, mechanical, almost impersonal. Signs of an enemy fighting not as individual pilots, but as an organized system. He brushed the thought aside. The Americans, he told himself, had no poetry in their flying. They didn't know what it meant to feel the machine become an extension of the body. "A Zero flies by thought," he had told a visiting correspondent once. The Americans fly with muscle. Still, as dusk settled over Rabaul, the airfield glowed orange under the flare of signal lamps, and Tanemori lingered by his aircraft longer than usual. The war had changed. The enemy was learning. He had seen the reports of new American tactics in the Solomons. Larger formations, coordinated attacks, more disciplined retreats. It was not the reckless adversary of 1942. Yet pride is a powerful shield. He convinced himself that the Zero's grace would always defeat American brute force. In Tokyo, admirals reviewed the same reports and came to the same comforting conclusion. The Hellcat was heavy, slow, and doomed by its design. The mathematics seemed certain. The Zero's wing loading and turning radius were unbeatable. No American aircraft could hope to match it in a traditional fight. But the equations of war were changing, and none of them knew it. The Hellcat was not designed to play by old rules. It was built for a different kind of sky, one where armor meant survival, where radios replaced instinct, and where victory would belong not to the fastest hand, but to the most coordinated machine. On the night of September 29th, as rain began to fall on the corrugated roofs of the Rabaul barracks, Tanemori sat at his desk, writing in his logbook. He wrote that he expected to encounter this new Hellcat soon, perhaps within weeks. He added a final line almost as an afterthought. If they have truly built a fighter that heavy, it will fall like a stone. It cannot climb. It cannot survive. He closed the book, unaware that the next time he opened it, the numbers would no longer favor him. The balance of the Pacific skies was about to tilt forever. Because the first time Lieutenant Colonel Kensuke Tanemori met a Hellcat in combat, he realized this was no flying tank, it was a predator. The date was September 30th, 1943. The location, Marcus Island, a lonely outpost north of the Marshall Chain, ringed by coral and mist. At dawn, a patrol of Japanese Zeros lifted from the airstrip, their engines humming with the familiar rhythm of confidence. Leading the escort formation was Petty Officer Yukio Fukuda, a 22-year-old pilot who had already tasted victory in the skies over Guadalcanal. His orders were simple: protect a reconnaissance plane photographing American carrier movements. The ocean below glittered in calm deception, as if the war itself had paused to watch what was about to unfold. 20 minutes into their mission, Fukuda's wingman called out over the radio, dark shapes rising from the southeast. 6 aircraft, single engine, climbing unnaturally fast. At first, Fukuda thought they were bombers, perhaps B-25s on an unusual heading. But then the silhouettes sharpened, sunlight flashing off their broad wings and heavy fuselages. They weren't bombers at all. They were something new, the Hellcats. The Americans didn't dive to flee. They climbed, straight into the sun. For a heartbeat, Fukuda hesitated. No enemy had ever done that. The Zero's entire doctrine revolved around turning, circling, bleeding speed, outmaneuvering the enemy until the kill came like a ritual. But this was vertical war. Fukuda pushed his throttle forward, chasing the nearest Hellcat into its climb. The air thinned. His engine began to whine. The Zero's light frame strained against gravity, its advantage slipping with every foot gained. Above him, the American fighter pivoted into a maneuver that physics itself seemed to reject. A hammerhead turn, rolling over at the top of its arc, dropping nose first with the fury of a falling blade. The first burst hit before Fukuda could even react. Tracer lines crossed the sky in a flash of orange and white. 6 heavy machine guns opened at once, spitting 4,000 rounds a minute. The air around the Zero became a cage of metal. Bullets tore through the right wing, shattered the canopy glass, and ripped into the fuselage. In 3 seconds, 17 rounds struck home. Fukuda felt the impact shudder through his body, his instruments flickering, the engine coughing in protest. He threw the aircraft into a desperate spin, a controlled fall that turned sky into sea and back again. The Hellcat didn't pursue. It didn't have to. Its job was done. When Fukuda leveled out at barely 100 meters above the water, smoke filled the cockpit, and the smell of burning oil choked his breath. His radio was dead. His wingman was gone. The reconnaissance plane they'd sworn to protect was nowhere in sight. He limped back toward Marcus Island, each minute feeling longer than the entire war. By the time he touched down, the Zero's wings were riddled with holes large enough to fit his hand through. Mechanics gathered silently around the crippled aircraft. One of them counted the impacts out loud, then stopped halfway, unable to go on. Fukuda stepped down from the cockpit, trembling, his flight suit soaked with oil and sweat. "It didn't turn," he said to his commanding officer. "It went straight up." The words hung in the humid air like a confession. That evening, in the debriefing tent, his report was met with disbelief. Senior officers dismissed his account as exaggeration, a product of confusion under fire. How could an aircraft twice as heavy as a Zero climb faster or dive with such control? They insisted it must have been luck or misidentification. Perhaps the Americans had caught him off guard with superior numbers. Fukuda didn't argue. He simply handed over a small piece of twisted metal he'd pulled from his cockpit panel, a fragment of an American .50 caliber round, flattened but unmistakable. It was heavier than any bullet he had ever seen. That night, he couldn't sleep. The image of that hammerhead maneuver replayed again and again behind his eyes, the way the Hellcat had climbed, rolled, and fallen with deliberate precision, as if guided by some invisible geometry of war that he didn't yet understand. The Zero had been built for grace. The Hellcat was built for dominance. In the following days, reports began trickling in from other islands. Brief, uncertain, always the same pattern. Encounters at altitude, sudden losses, survivors describing impossible climbs and devastating firepower. To the pilots who had once believed in the poetry of flight, it was like discovering that the sky itself had turned hostile. The air, once their ally, now belonged to something heavier, louder, unyielding. And while the young mechanics at Marcus Island patched bullet holes under the tropical rain, the officers in Tokyo dismissed the warnings. They said no machine could change the laws of dogfighting. No amount of armor could outfly skill. They filed the reports away, confident that their mathematics still ruled the air. But mathematics, like pride, is brittle when reality changes its rules. And the next time the Zeros met the Hellcats, over the wide expanse of Wake Island, even the most loyal believers would see that the age of turning duels was over, and a new kind of war had begun. It was October 5th, 1943. Dawn spilled across the Pacific like molten gold, touching the waterlogged runways of Wake Island, a coral fortress surrounded by nothing but sky and sea. Lieutenant Shoji Sato, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, led his formation of 12 Zeros into the morning light. The radio crackled with calm confidence. They had altitude, the one advantage every Japanese pilot understood could mean victory. Below them, tiny specks began to rise, 12 dark blue aircraft climbing in tight formation. "Hellcats," someone said over the headset, half amused. They looked heavy even from afar, their broad wings glinting like shields. Sato smiled. The plan was simple. Use the height advantage, dive from the sun, and cut them apart before they could respond. That was how it had always worked. When you owned the high ground, you owned the kill. The Zeros rolled over in unison and dove. The wind howled against their canopies as they built speed, sunlight flashing from their wingtips like blades. But the moment they fired, something unexpected happened. The Americans didn't scatter. The Hellcats held formation, their pilots steady, their wings locked as if bound by invisible lines. The bullets sparked harmlessly off their armor, tracing silver streaks across fuselages that refused to break. Within seconds, the Zeros had spent their opening burst. Sato banked hard, ready for the next pass. Then the world turned upside down. The Hellcats didn't try to outturn them. They climbed. The heavy planes rose back toward the clouds with terrifying energy, the roar of their engines swelling like thunder. Sato pulled up to follow, but his Zero began to shudder. Its light frame, once the symbol of perfect balance, was now its curse. He watched in disbelief as the Hellcats rolled over at the peak of their climb and dove straight back down. They weren't fighting individually. They were striking in pairs, trading altitude for speed. using the weight the Japanese had mocked as a weapon. One Zero vanished in a flash of flame, then another. The sky filled with spirals of smoke as the dogfight dissolved into chaos. In just minutes, 8 Zeros were gone. Not a single Hellcat fell. The survivors, including Sato himself, broke off and retreated toward the sea. When they landed, fuel nearly gone, there was no shouting, no anger, only silence. The air crews examined the aircraft that had returned. Bullet holes everywhere, yes, but the Americans' planes had stayed in the air. The Zeros, by comparison, burned the moment they were touched. Sato's own wingman had vanished after a burst tore through his unarmored cockpit. No armor plate, no self-sealing fuel tanks, nothing between man and fire. What had once made the Zero the most agile fighter in the world was now what doomed it. The Hellcat's armor weighed it down, but it also made it endure. That endurance meant its pilots could live to fight again, and with every mission they survived, they became sharper, more experienced. The weight of the Hellcat wasn't a flaw, it was a learning engine. Every pound of steel, every drop of fuel, every sheet of bulletproof glass existed for one purpose: to give the pilot a second chance. The Americans had turned survival into strategy. The Japanese, still chasing perfection in maneuver and form, were facing an opponent built to evolve. In the officer's tent that night, Sato tried to explain what he had seen. His report was brief, almost hesitant. "Their formation never broke," he said. "They fight as one body." The words unsettled his superiors, not because they sounded impossible, but because they sounded true. For 2 years, the Imperial Navy had celebrated the individual, the lone ace, the duelist, the artist in the sky. The Hellcat didn't care about artistry. It cared about efficiency. Its pilots spoke over radios that allowed perfect coordination. Its weight gave them the freedom to take hits, to dive through danger, to return and fight again tomorrow. That was the quiet revolution, the shift from warrior to system.
Just tired.
One Japanese officer, watching the footage from captured film reels weeks later, muttered under his breath, "We fought warriors. They built a machine." In those words lay the tragedy of an entire doctrine. The brilliance of the Zero had never been in question, nor the courage of the men who flew it. But courage could not weld metal, and skill could not replace armor. The American philosophy of war had changed. It no longer sought elegance in motion, but endurance in numbers. Every Hellcat that returned intact became a teacher. Every pilot who survived one more mission became an instructor for the next. By contrast, Japan was losing its most seasoned flyers faster than it could replace them. The balance of experience was shifting with every battle. Sato knew it as he looked out across the sea the following morning. The wreckage of his comrades still floated on the waves, glittering in the early light like broken wings. He realized then that the war had turned from contest to calculus, and Japan was on the wrong side of the equation. The very thing they had mocked, the bulk, the armor, the industrial weight of American design, was now the reason those blue shapes ruled the sky. In 1943, they laughed at it. In 1944, they would envy it. And as the next wave of Hellcats rose from carrier decks across the Pacific, the Americans were about to unleash the one doctrine Japan could never match: fighting as a machine. By the spring of 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Kensuke Tanemori had begun to understand that the air war had changed shape. It no longer belonged to the gifted individual or the fearless ace. It belonged to those who could think and move as one body. From the cockpit of his Zero, he watched new American formations appear on the horizon. Pairs of Hellcats, one flying high, one low, working together with a precision that seemed mechanical. When one dove into combat, the other stayed above, guarding its tail and ready to strike from altitude. It was not instinct, but coordination, a language of tactics Japan had never learned to speak. These pilots didn't fight duels. They executed maneuvers like gears inside an engine. And somewhere beyond the clouds, unseen hands were guiding them. On American carrier decks hundreds of miles away, radar operators tracked every dot of light that moved across their screens. From these signals, ground controllers directed entire squadrons by radio, adjusting altitude, speed, and interception angles with mathematical precision. To Tanemori's men, who still relied on eyesight and intuition, the effect was terrifying. Hellcats appeared out of nowhere, diving from cloud cover or rising from the glare of the sun as if they could sense their targets before seeing them. Pilots returning from these encounters spoke of being ambushed in clear skies, attacked from directions no one had expected. They called it the invisible enemy. What they didn't realize was that this invisibility came not from stealth, but from synchronization. American fighters were being guided by technology that could see through the dark, by a network that connected pilots, ships, and strategy in real time. It was war conducted by mathematics, not by instinct. For the Japanese airmen who had grown up believing that combat was an art form, a duel between souls, this was an unthinkable transformation. The cockpit, once a stage for personal mastery, had become one component in a vast system. Back in Japan, the cracks in the old training regime were widening. Before the war, a naval pilot trained for nearly 3 years, accumulating over 700 flight hours before entering combat. By 1944, fuel shortages and rushed replacements had reduced that number to barely 200. Some recruits were lucky to see a live round before their first mission. Most practiced in gliders, learning takeoffs without engines, firing no more than 50 bullets at paper targets before being sent into battle. Across the ocean, American cadets were flying in formation over Texas, learning to land on carrier decks built into the desert, and logging over 300 hours in flight before they ever saw combat. Each one knew his instruments, his radio, and his wingman's voice by heart. The difference wasn't just in skill, it was in the philosophy of preparation. America had turned training into production, turning young men into professionals who could be inserted seamlessly into a machine already in motion. One of those differences was illustrated with painful clarity during a skirmish off Truk Lagoon in early 1944. Ensign Hiroshi Yamamoto, barely 21 and freshly graduated from flight school, took off for his first combat patrol. He had never flown at night, never fired his guns in the air, and had trained without a working radio. When the enemy came, he never saw them. Hellcats, vectored by radar from a carrier more than 50 miles away, dropped out of the clouds and struck from above. Yamamoto's aircraft was hit within seconds. He ejected from his burning Zero, parachuting into the sea, and was rescued hours later by a passing patrol boat. He survived only 7 minutes in his first combat. In his report, he described the experience with disbelief. They knew exactly where we were, our heading, our altitude, our path. It was as if they could see in the dark. His commanders didn't know how to explain it. The truth was that the Americans could see in the dark, not with eyes, but with machines. By mid-1944, Tanemori himself began to sense the futility. Every battle now felt orchestrated by forces beyond sight. When he spotted Hellcats in the distance, he knew they already knew where he was. His flight of 4 aircraft would split, trying to draw the enemy into traditional dogfights. But the Americans refused to play. They struck once, hard and fast, and then climbed away, conserving energy, leaving behind wreckage and confusion. It wasn't courage that defeated Japan's pilots. It was discipline. The discipline of men who fought by design, not by chance. The lesson was as cruel as it was clear. Japan's faith in intuition had met America's mastery of systems, and instinct was losing. The days when a single ace could decide a battle were gone. Now, victory came from coordination, calculation, and communication. From the quiet hum of radar screens and the measured voices of controllers calling vectors into the night. When the skies filled again with the sound of engines, they carried with them the rhythm of an empire built on organization. The machine had learned to fight, and it had learned to see. By mid-1944, Japanese pilots could still fight, but they could no longer hide. The moment that truth became undeniable came on June 19, 1944, the day history would remember as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea in a haze of gold and smoke. From the decks of 9 Japanese carriers, 450 aircraft roared into the sky, the last concentrated strike force of an air empire that had once ruled the Pacific. They flew under the banner of Operation A-Go, a plan to crush the American fleet near the Marianas and restore air superiority. But waiting for them beyond the horizon was Task Force 58, 15 American carriers, nearly 1,000 aircraft, and a radar-guided wall of steel that would erase Japan's aerial pride in a single day. It began long before the Japanese pilots ever saw the enemy. American radar operators aboard the USS Enterprise picked up the incoming formations from 150 miles away. In darkened control rooms, calm voices relayed altitude, heading, and estimated intercept points to the Hellcat squadrons already circling above the fleet. Pilots adjusted their positions with quiet precision, guided not by chance but by coordinates. When the first wave of Japanese aircraft approached, the Americans were waiting at altitude, the sun behind them, a perfect ambush arranged by mathematics. Lieutenant Colonel Kensuke Tanemori, flying with the lead element of the Japanese strike group, saw them first. Rows of dark silhouettes glinting like blades suspended in the sunlight. For a brief second, he thought they were clouds. Then the sky exploded. The first engagement lasted 12 minutes. In that short window, 42 Japanese planes fell in flames. The Americans lost none. The radio channels erupted in confusion. Screams, static, broken commands. The Hellcats dove through the formations like hawks through sparrows, slashing once, then climbing away. Tanemori tried to rally his men, but the sky itself seemed to be disintegrating. Everywhere he looked, blue shapes curved in perfect arcs, coordinated by unseen control. There was no longer a battle line, no duels, no honor in the old sense. Only the relentless choreography of organized power. When his own fuel gauge began to dip, he turned toward the sea, realizing with bitter clarity that the battle was already lost. Back aboard the American carriers, the atmosphere was calm, almost clinical. Pilots returned, refueled, rearmed, and launched again within minutes. Every action was part of a rhythm honed by months of preparation. Among them was Commander David McCampbell, the leader of Air Group 15 from the USS Essex. On that day, McCampbell shot down 7 aircraft before noon, his wingman 6 more. 4 months later, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he would achieve 9 kills in a single mission, 5 fighters and 4 bombers without taking a single hit. When asked afterward what gave the Hellcat its advantage, he simply said, "We didn't fight their fight. We fought ours." His calm understatement masked the scale of transformation that had occurred. For Japan, the psychological impact was devastating. The Zero, once a symbol of invincibility, had become a death trap. The best pilots were gone, and the new ones were too inexperienced to survive long enough to learn. Many returned from their first sortie in shock, describing invisible attacks from all directions. Some began to speak of Hellcat ghosts, the belief that American fighters could appear and vanish at will, guided by machines that saw through clouds and darkness. Military psychologists would later call it Hellcat psychosis, a collective trauma born from hopeless odds and endless loss. The Imperial Navy, unable to replenish its aces or counter the enemy's system, began to consider the unthinkable: turning its pilots themselves into weapons. The transition was slow, at first spoken of only in whispers among officers. What if, they argued, a pilot could become the bomb his aircraft carried? What if the last act of a defeated Air Force was to redefine sacrifice itself? From that desperation, the kamikaze idea took shape, not as fanaticism, but as mathematics. If 1-0 could no longer outfight a Hellcat, perhaps it could still outdie it. It was logic born of extinction. But for the men still flying, like Tanamori, that logic offered no comfort. In the weeks after the Philippine Sea, he watched replacement pilots arrive. Boys barely out of school, trained on wooden mock-ups, eyes wide with determination but empty of experience. He tried to teach them what little still mattered: discipline, patience, respect for the machine. Yet deep down, he knew that the war had shifted to a plane of technology his nation could no longer reach. Every time he climbed into his cockpit, he understood he was stepping into the past while his enemy flew the future. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended with the near annihilation of Japan's carrier aviation. 350 aircraft destroyed, hundreds of pilots lost, and an empire's faith in its air arm shattered beyond repair. The Hellcat had not just won the skies, it had broken the spirit that once defined them. And when the next great battle came at Leyte Gulf, the story repeated itself. The Americans controlled the air with effortless precision, while the Japanese fleet, desperate and blind, sent its final aces into hopeless missions. McCampbell rose again into those skies, his Hellcat streaking into formations that barely fired back. The same machine that Japan had mocked a year earlier now dominated the Pacific from horizon to horizon. As the smoke cleared and the carriers recovered their aircraft, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. Japan's once unstoppable air arm was gone. What remained were fragments, training schools with no fuel, factories short of metal, and pilots taught to die rather than fight. In that void, the kamikaze would be born, the ultimate expression of a doctrine that could no longer survive. When your enemy turns his pilots into weapons, the war has already been lost, but the lessons were only beginning. In 1945, Japan surrendered, but the Hellcat's true victory was just being understood. Across the ruins of the Pacific, the smoke cleared not only from battlefields, but from an entire philosophy of warfare. For years, Japan's Zero had symbolized purity of design, the idea that agility, courage, and sacrifice could overcome weight and armor. The Hellcat had proven otherwise. It was not the faster or more graceful machine. It was simply the smarter one. And behind it stood a system capable of learning, adapting, and producing faster than any individual hero could fly. In the months after the war, one man understood this truth better than most. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, the designer of the Zero, was invited to study captured American aircraft. Among them was a Hellcat, parked quietly on an airfield outside Tokyo, its paint faded, its cockpit empty. Horikoshi ran his hands along the fuselage, tracing the rivets, studying the thick plates of armor, the reinforced frames, the engine built with such precision that every part could be replaced by another from any factory. When he was asked what he thought, he answered softly, "We built for 1941. They built for 1945." It was an acknowledgement not of defeat, but of progress. An admission that the Americans had not built a fighter, they had built an ecosystem of innovation. The scale of that system was almost beyond imagination. On Long Island, New York, the Grumman factory at Bethpage operated around the clock, producing a new Hellcat every 60 minutes. Day and night, welders, engineers, and factory workers, many of them women, assembled machines that would never see the skies they helped win. By the end of the war, over 12,000 Hellcats had been built in just 30 months. Each was identical, reliable, and immediately ready for combat. No two Zeros had ever been exactly the same, hand-fitted by artisans who still believed in craftsmanship over consistency. The contrast told the story of two civilizations, one that sought perfection through individual mastery, and another that sought victory through collective precision. For Japan, the collapse of its air arm was more than military. It was cultural. The ancient code of Bushido had elevated personal valor above survival, and the Zero had embodied that spirit perfectly. Light, unarmored, and lethal in the hands of a master. But in the industrial age, heroism was no longer enough. The Hellcat represented a new creed, systematic survival, the belief that strength lay in protection, preparation, and cooperation. Where the Bushido pilot embraced death, the Hellcat pilot was trained to come home. And each time he did, he carried his experience back into the system, improving it. The Americans had made war recursive, self-correcting, evolutionary. In that sense, the Hellcat's greatest triumph was not destruction, but learning. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1962, the United States Navy hosted a symposium on the air war in the Pacific. Veterans from both sides attended, men who had once tried to kill each other, now sitting side by side under the same flag of history. Among them were Commander David McCampbell, America's top Navy ace, and Saburo Sakai, Japan's surviving legend. When asked to summarize the war in the air, McCampbell said simply, "The Hellcat won the Pacific." Sakai, his once patched eye now gray with age, nodded slowly. "The Zero was a superior fighter," he said, "but the Hellcat was a superior weapon system. It owned the sky because it owned the system." In that single exchange, decades of blood and pride were distilled into a truth that transcended victory or defeat. The Hellcat had not only dominated the air, it had redefined what it meant to fight. The real legacy of the Hellcat was human, not mechanical. It proved that protecting a pilot's life was not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. It showed that courage and compassion could coexist, that efficiency could serve humanity rather than consume it. Every extra pound of armor, every self-sealing tank, every bolt of reinforced steel spoke of a civilization that valued its people enough to keep them alive. The Hellcat's victory, then, was not just against the Zero, it was against the very idea that honor required self-destruction. It taught that the measure of strength is not how many are willing to die, but how many are enabled to live and return. When the war ended, the surviving Japanese pilots stood on airfields under the rising sun, watching American Hellcats land peacefully beside their own wrecked machines. They no longer saw enemies, only evidence of what they might have become if the course of history had been different. To them, the Hellcat was not a monster, but a mirror, a reflection of what happens when industry, education, and humanity align with purpose. In the years that followed, Japan rebuilt not its empire, but its factories and schools. The very philosophy that had once destroyed them, systematic design, shared knowledge, collective improvement, became the foundation of their recovery. The lessons of the Hellcat echoed quietly through that transformation, reminding the world that technology is never just about machines. It is about what those machines say about the people who build them. The Pacific War ended, but its echoes carried into every hangar, every assembly line, every classroom that taught a young engineer the value of precision and protection. The Hellcat's roar faded into history, but its message endured. Progress is built not by the hands of the few, but by the minds of the many. They once said the Hellcat was too heavy to fly. History proved it was Japan's pride that couldn't lift off again. If you've made it this far, thank you for flying through history with us. Now it's your turn. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think the Hellcat truly changed the war, or a 0 if you believe something else did. I read every single one. And if you love stories like this, real people, real machines, and the lessons they still carry, make sure to subscribe and stay with us.
We did a really good
The
job
next
on
story
this
is
one.
already warming up its engines.